And you are all set?
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, Faith. Hello, Patrick. Patrick at least knows me, but I am Douglas Hemphill. I am one of the campus instructional designers, and joining me today is Carrie Mosick, our other campus instructional designers. This is kind of a crash course on Brightspace. So we are going to be covering a lot of material without going very far into depth on anything. That said, I am hardly one to stand on ceremony, so if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt and we'll happily dive down a rabbit hole. So that said, I am going to share my screen. And what you should be seeing now is your screen when you log into Brightspace initially. Easiest way to get here, at least in my opinion, is to go to oswego.edu/mylearning. But there is a link on the main homepage. Sorry, I got to move my Zoom control bar out of the way. So if a student needs to get to it or you just want to get to it, you can go to the little guy here and just click Brightspace. And it will do the same thing. It will take you right to your login for Brightspace. And once you've logged in and done your multi-factor authentication, this is the screen that you will see. Now, one thing I want to show you on the home screen, this is the screen that shows all of the courses that you are taking. And any general news or announcements, which would usually cover system outages or stuff that the university has asked us to look at. But one thing you have here is your Quickly course tools. And we're going to see if this will actually load for me. It may or may not, because I have a lot of courses. But the big thing that this lets you do is turn your courses on and off. So when we create courses for each semester, by default, they are turned off. So the easiest way to turn them on is to come into this screen, go to course availability, and you will see your courses, and you can simply turn them on and off with a simple toggle. As you can see, I have a lot of courses. So that's just by far the easiest way to activate your courses at the beginning of a semester. Remember, for online courses, we do have a preview week, so as much as possible, we do like to try and open courses a week, the Monday before courses start, or if there's a holiday like Martin Luther King Day, the Tuesday before courses start. So with that, you have two ways to access your courses. You can go down and look at all of your courses, sorting by semester. We are working on trying to hide some of these older semesters so they won't, so you won't have quite so much to go through. But you can also always do the waffle iron up here, which gives you access to all of your courses. You can search for whatever you need. So, for example, what you might do is just look at all of your spring 2025 courses and just pin those so that they're very easy to find. So for my purposes, I'm going to go into one of my practice courses. And now we see the home page. So before we were on the what's called the institutional homepage, now we're on the course homepage. If I ever need to get back to the institutional homepage, I just click on the Oswego logo and I'm right back there. Now, one of the most important things on here is the announcements widget. So announcements are a great way of generating what we call instructor presence, basically just letting your students know that you're around. And they're really easy to use. You just click new announcement, or you can go to all announcements for the deeper interface, and you give it a title, which can be something as simple as, let's say, welcome to week one. And this could be a rundown of what they have to do in week one. It could be a rundown of current events. Basically, it's just a way of you letting your students know that you are still that you are in the course and actively participating. Now I'm going to go off on a tangent for a moment because I do want to talk about this text interface, which is called a what you see is what you get interface, or a WYSIWYG. Um, this works very similar to a word processor. You'll find a lot of the same commands in terms of indenting, putting up bullets, changing text colors, or underlining and things like that. But there are a couple of unique commands. Probably the most important is insert stuff. And this is how you can link to files from your computer. Or more notably, this is how you embed Panopto videos. You can also enter embed codes from things like YouTube or insert links, but there's other quick keys to do that. Other than that, I think most of this, if you hover over the item, is self-explanatory. Um, And then if you're good with HTML, you can always open up the raw source code and edit that directly, and just make sure you save your changes. Then as we scroll down a little bit, you can delay when an announcement is released. So if you wanted to write an announcement on Saturday and have it come out Monday, you can certainly do that. You can have announcements disappear after a set amount of time. If you don't want to add a document into the content area, you can make it a separate attachment, which sometimes makes it easier to see. Release conditions are basically, there's conditions for them, like if you get above a 90 on a quiz, this announcement will show to you. That's one of those rabbit holes, so we aren't going to go into that right now, but it is an option. And if you're very ambitious, you can even stack announcements for an entire semester and just use them, use the start dates to have them come out as you want. The only thing I would caution you is don't promise anything in those announcements. Like, don't make an announcement at the beginning of the semester and save it that says, hey, your tests will be graded Wednesday, because life happens and you don't want to have to worry about explaining why the announcement went out when the tests weren't graded because you lost power in an ice storm. And you can see I've got a lot of stored announcements. So once an announcement is made, you can always go back and edit it, which you've got all the same options, but the additional option is you have what's called a major edit. So when you make an announcement, by default, it will send an email to students. But if you're just making a minor edit to it, it will not send an email out again. But if you check major edit, it will resend the email to basically let students know, hey, you really need to read this again. Now, I don't have any here, but the other thing that you will see on the homepage is updates, and that'll tell you, hey, there's new assignments submitted, new discussions you haven't read. Basically, from your perspective, it will show you student work that's been submitted. The calendar doesn't do as much for you. That's more a student-facing option. Um, and that really only comes into play if you're using due dates. Other than that, across the top, course home will always bring you back to this page. Content, we will touch on later, but that's really the core of your course. That's where students go to get their content. Groups is for setting up groups, if you decide to use those functionalities. Course progress, again, we'll revisit, but this lets students know how they're doing. This is really the student portal into their grades and their progress. Library resources is just a boilerplate text. Course tools is where we will be going next. So we'll be right back here. The main thing to know is in our interface, course tools is not visible to students. Some institutions make that visible to students, and a lot of the Brightspace support, if you go to the Brightspace main page, we'll talk about how students can access stuff through course tools. That is not true for our institution. We've decided to centralize everything through content. Quick Eval just lets you grade work without going into the work. If you have questions about that, Carrie uses that a lot more than I do. And then help just gives you a lot of different sources that you can go to for assistance. So with that, I'm going to jump into course tools. And you can create most of your assessments directly from content, but I find it easier to organize things if we do it through course tools first and then pull it into content, and I will show you how to do that. But we're just going to start with assignments. So an assignment is really probably the most basic thing that you can use Brightspace for. It is a Dropbox, and it has some advantages over turning papers in person because you always have a record of it. So a student can't say, I slipped it under your door, the janitor must have picked it up, or I know I gave it to you, I think you lost it. No, it's either in Brightspace or it's not. So to create an assignment, we just go new assignment. And the first thing we do is just give it a title. Now, for fully online courses, they're usually broken up into modules. So I actually use a unique naming scheme in terms of, I will say something like M2A1, which is module 2, assignment 1, and then I give it a meaningful title. I try to avoid naming things just like assignment or turn your work in here or something like this. I try to actually call it like something that has some meaning. So then if it is a graded assignment, you simply say how many points you want to grade it out of, and it will automatically put it in the grade book under this title. And then you can go organize your grade book after the fact. The due date is exactly what it sounds like. So you simply say, okay, this is when this assignment is due. Now, by itself, this does not turn off access to the assignment. It simply starts marking things as late. There is a setting in the gradebook that will automatically give anything that has not been turned off by that, or sorry, anything that has not been turned in by the due date a 0. But the problem is students can go in after the fact and turn in the work and get that 0 replaced with whatever the grade on the assignment is. So to avoid that, we get into the availability dates and conditions. This really controls when students can submit the work and when they cannot submit the work. By default, they will see the title, but they will not see any instructions. They will not see the submit button. It will simply say, here's the assignment, here's when it will become available, here's when it will be due. Other than that, it works exactly the way you would think it does. It gives you the start date and start time. And then if you want it to be locked down at some later point, easy peasy. Again, you do have release conditions, which you can use to trigger when things become available. So you have to get a 90 on a quiz, then this will become available. Special access is for students that, for whatever reason, need dates that are different from the start and end date and the due date. So you can manually set those for individual students. Submission and completion, you shouldn't have to worry too much about, except that this is where we see group assignments. Now, we're not going to get into how we handle and create those assignments, but basically, if you have a group, you can set it to group assignments, give it to that group, and only one person in that group will be able to submit the work. And then when you grade it, it will go back to everybody. You can change the file type so that there's some different options. You can even change the file extension, so you can say something like, well, you have to turn it in as a PDF. By default, we will always keep all submissions. That's what I would recommend. It's always good to have a record. And then evaluation and feedback. For the purposes of an assignment, it really only comes into play when we're doing adding a rubric, but you can do things like hiding the name of the assignment, or this is where our copyright detection tools live. Again, I'm not going to get deep into Turnitin, but basically if you click that link, you can turn Turnitin on. Now this only checks for plagiarism. It does not have an AI detector on it because so far we haven't been terribly impressed by the outputs of those detectors, but that's an ongoing conversation. Once you've done all of that, you will see at the bottom of the screen, by default, this is hidden. This overrides everything else. If it is hidden, students will not see it. So once you're ready, you do need to turn it on. And then I can always edit an assignment simply by grabbing the pull down and editing the assignment, which would bring me right back to that screen. This is also where I would go to view and grade submissions. Now, I don't have any submissions, but what if I did, I would see them for each student, and usually I just click on the first student, grade their work, publish it, and go to the next student. So it's pretty straightforward. So yeah, oh, okay. Gary did answer that. Okay, great. So next we're going to look at discussions. Especially in an online course, discussions are really one of the main ways that you form a sense of community. Um, we can have whole sessions on writing good discussion questions and setting up good discussion practices. But for now, we're just going to talk about creating a discussion. Now, what you'll notice is every discussion has two titles. The black title is what's referred to as a forum. The blue title is what's referred to as a topic. The forum is basically a bucket that can contain multiple topics. In a lot of cases, we just have one forum for one topic because that's kind of the default option. But what you really need to understand is what students are accessing is the topic, not the forum. So it's always going to prompt you to create a new forum first. But when I do that, I can go ahead and create a new topic automatically. But really, all I want to do is give this a name. I don't want to give it a description. I don't want to play with the restrictions. The one thing that you might want to set if you're using multiple topics under one thing is that users must start a thread before they can read and reply to other threads in each topic. And that's what we refer to as post first. So I'm going to save and close that. And now at the bottom of my screen, I have my new forum and I've got my topic. So all I'm going to do is go ahead and edit my topic. And this is where I would ask my question. Now, other than that, this should look very familiar to what you saw in the assignments area. Again, I can give points to it and it'll automatically go in the grade book. The one thing you will notice is that this does not have a due date. For reasons that I don't really understand, you can only add the due date to discussions in the content area. And I will show you how to do that.
There's in the chat, Doug, someone had asked, is there an easy way, or Ben had asked, is there a easy way to add a rubric at this point?
Easy depends on the eye of the beholder, but yes. So give me 30 seconds and we'll be there. So the availability dates and conditions work exactly the same way they do in the assignment, except that in this case, if you have groups, it will change it into what's called a group discussion. So you can see that usually what we would use is the second option. So users can only view their own group. And again, this won't work unless you have groups created. There is kind of the interesting option, though, that they can view everybody's topic and all of the threads, but they wouldn't be able to post into anybody's but their own. Post completion is simply the same thing that we saw before. It allows you to do post first at the topic level. Now, evaluation and feedback, what you will see is the option to add a rubric. This appears on everything that's an assessment, but it's used the most with discussions. Now, to build a rubric, you simply click Add Rubric and Create New. But building the actual rubric can be a little complicated, especially if you want to do anything fancy. So that's the kind of thing that I tend to say, follow up with us via help@oswego.edu, and we'll work with you to build a rubric that works for you. So adding it is not complicated, but building something that really meets your needs can be a little bit more complicated. So I hope that answers that question. And yeah, it works the same way for assignments. You'll just have that button to add a rubric, but again, think about what you want your rubric to look at first, then drop us a line and we'll help you realize that within the context of Brightspace. And once you have a rubric, when you go to grade, you'll have an option to pull up the rubric and just use that to grade the assignment. Now there is the option to evaluate each post individually. We don't use this that often, because it interacts with the gradebook a little bit strangely if it's not set up correctly. So usually we find it easiest to just grade holistically. There's a way to look at every post that a student did and just read through them all and give them a grade on the rubric. But if you would prefer to do individual grading, this is another case where I would say contact us and we'll help you set it up to make sure it works properly. So again, when I'm done with everything, I save and close it. Again, for me, it happens to be at the bottom. And if I go in here, this is where I have my option to assess topics. And what happens in this case is when I click on a student, it would show me every post that that student has made, and it'll differentiate between, okay, here's a primary post, here's a reply, and if I need to, it even has links so I can go back and see what they've replied to. So I think that covers discussions. So the next thing on the docket is quizzes. Now, quizzes are probably a little more complicated. Now, they start out very similar. You have your quiz title, but you'll notice that I can't modify the points. The points are automatically calculated based on the points for the questions that are in the system. But so when I create a question, and I'm just going to create a multiple choice question really quickly. Now you can randomize the order of the questions, or sorry, the order of the answers on a question, but it can only be done at the question level. So you want to really decide ahead of time whether or not you're going to do that so you don't have to walk back through and redo all your questions. So I have a question, and you'll see it automatically updated the score. Now this does not by default go in the gradebook, so you have to change it to set it to go in the gradebook. You see you have the date option again. There's a lot of different question types. And you have the option to pull in questions from your textbook publisher, though I would encourage you to modify them for your own purposes. I would say you can broadly think of quizzing in two ways. You can think of a high stakes quiz, so something like a midterm, or you can think of low stakes or mastery quizzes where students can take a quiz multiple times, and it's more a knowledge check for both you and the students to see where they're at without having major impacts on their grade. I will say for high stakes testing, I would not use multiple choice. AI in particular has gotten extremely good at answering multiple choice questions. It's getting better at answering essay questions as well, but it's just something to be aware of that multiple choice is probably better for self-checks than for actual evaluation at this point. On the side, you have your same availability dates and conditions, the same option for special access. Now, if a student needs extra time, you can do that through special access, but there's actually a better way that I will show you in just a second. Now, quizzing has a new option that you don't see anywhere else, which is the ability to set a time limit. So once a student starts, that counter starts running, and even if they leave, that counter still runs. Now the one thing is it is supposed to auto submit when the time is up, but if a student leaves before the time runs up, sometimes this can hang up. So if you've got a quiz that a student tells you they did, or you see it's in progress, but it's not submitted, just drop us a line and we'll send you the instructions on how to get it to submit. You have the option to shuffle all your questions. And normally you would allow one attempt, but as I said, if you're doing mastery quizzing, you can allow multiple attempts up to unlimited. And then you have your evaluation and feedback. So this gets a little odd because you have your initial item. So basically, as soon as students finish the quiz, what do they see? But I may not want to share out all of the answers right at this point. So I do have the option to add additional views. And what I do is just go into editing the views. I add an additional view and I say this view will not be released until probably the due date, whenever it's due. And you can just customize it to show more details. So again, I know that's very quick. And I would just say again, if you really want a deeper dive into quizzing, that's something where you can drop into our office hours or send us a request for a one-on-one meeting. Again, you'll notice by default this is hidden, so whatever I do need to turn it on if I want students to be able to take it. But that is that. Now, the other thing that is under course tools that is of use to you is the roster. Now, this will show you everybody in their class, and it allows you to send emails directly out of Brightspace. So you don't have to look up their address, you don't have to open up Gmail to send it. You can do it from right here, and that's actually what we recommend because then it will keep a record of that email in Brightspace. So if a student says, hey, I never got this from you, you can pull it up and say, well, there it is. Now, the other thing I mentioned was extra time. What you'll see is when you expand a student, you have this option for editing accommodations. And what this allows you to do is modify the time limit. And usually, students get time and a half or 2 times. So you just change the multiplier and you click save. And now it'll have this little cog, which indicates that that student has accommodations. And that goes throughout the entire course on anything that has a timer on it, which is normally going to be a quiz. Okay, so finally, I want to look at the heart of the course, which is our content area. Now, it's not immediately obvious, but if you click on Table of Contents, you will actually get some additional tools. And the one that I actually like in here is View Reports. It gives you some access to some very basic reports about what your students are doing in the class. Again, we're not going to dive into that, but at least be aware that it is there. Overview and bookmarks do not show up to students unless you fill something in on them. And we usually recommend that you use Getting Started and Course Syllabus folders instead. We do have a course structure, and that can be provided to you upon request. But for a brand new course, what I'm going to start by doing is creating a module. Now, modules will always appear on this left menu. And if I want to work in a module, I simply click on it. And then I can add sub-modules, or you'll often hear these referred to as folders. Now, the main thing to be aware of is one sub-module is fine. What you don't want to do is go into a sub-module, which is actually a little difficult, and create a sub-module within that module. When you start nesting too many folders, one, makes the course very confusing for students, and two, it kind of breaks the display. It won't indent folders anymore, and it really becomes a mess. So really you want your module and then one sub-module within that. But don't go nesting things any further than that. Now, in terms of getting content into a module, you can always create new materials. So we would ask that you don't use the video and audio option. There's something called Panopto that works much better. But the most basic thing is just to upload a file. And usually you would do this from your computer. And you would simply find a link that you want to upload. In a face-to-face course, this would often be your rubrics or your syllabus. In an online course, it might be your mini lectures. It could be any number of things. But once it's there as a student, I just click on it. And for most things, it will give me a preview. So this just happened to be something that I was looking up. So it's just showing it as pure text. If it was Word or PDF, it'd be a little bit of a fancier display. Now, this one's a little confusing, but what they mean by create a file is this is actually if you want to write text directly into Brightspace. This is by far the most accessible thing for students, and you can just copy and paste out of a Word document into here, or even out of a website, though you do want to be a little careful of things like copyright. You do want to attribute where you're getting something from, but it's as easy as that. And of course, I can type in here as normal. And this is also a great option for integrating multimedia because I can embed YouTube videos, Panopto videos, images, anything like that directly into this interface. I can make it full screen if I want a little more area to work with, but when I'm done, I simply save and close. Oh, sorry. Okay. Um, Simply save and close. And this is pretty much exactly how it will show up for students. And if you've got multiple things, they can simply use these arrows to navigate through the different areas. Last but not least, you've got the ability to create a link. This literally is simply putting in a link. Again, you can cut and paste. but it points them out. And the main thing is to make sure it opens in its own screen. If you try to open things into your inside Brightspace, it often creates issues. So it'll simply ask the student to open it in a new window. Now, the other side of this is the stuff that we already created. So everything we just looked at was under upload and create. If you go into existing activities, well, you've got assignments. So I can look through every assignment that I made and simply click on an assignment, and it's right there. The same is true for quizzes. And for discussions, the one difference with discussions is the first thing it will ask you is the topic. And then it'll have you click on the discussion, or sorry, the first thing it asks you is the form, then it'll have you click on the topic. Now, the one thing I did note before was that you cannot set due dates for discussions except in the content area. So on any of these things, you can tell it, I want to edit properties in place. And specifically for discussions, when I go to add and edit dates, I suddenly have the ability to put in a due date. Again, I do not know why you can only do it there. But once I hit update, you'll see now I have a due date there. So I can do changes on the fly in here using that edit in place option. The other thing is you'll see this eyeball just to the right. This shows whether it's visible or not. So I can make it invisible, or I can make it visible, or I can delete it. If you are deleting something, always use the first option. The second option can have unintended consequences. So it's just better for everybody if we don't use that one. In terms of once you've created content, you can move stuff around by grabbing these 8 dots. It's really easy to move stuff within a folder, but I can also drag stuff to other folders and simply drop it there. And now if I go to that folder, it's right at the bottom. I do want to give a special call out to Panopto, because again, that is our choice for video mounting within Brightspace. Dan Laird is the specialist on that. But you will see that the most basic way of doing this is going to existing activities, external learning tools, and I just had it. And Panopto Video OSW. And now you've got a link specific to this course to any videos that you want students to have access to. There's better ways of doing it in terms of embedding and stuff like that, but this is the most basic way to do it. Just be aware that as an instructor, when you go in, it's going to give you the editing version, whereas when a student goes in, it'll just give them a list of the videos. So I do want to touch on the grade book. As I noted, when you create a lot of stuff, it will simply add it directly into the gradebook. So there's all the stuff that I created now. But usually you will want to run the setup wizard. You can do this before or after you've created the gradebook. And this will simply walk you through some of the most basic questions. However, what you don't want to do is play with a gradebook once grades are in. We always encourage people to come to office hours or go to help@oswego.edu in order to get assistance with the gradebook because it is by far the most confusing and complicated part of Brightspace. And we would just ask that you try to do that before you enter in any grades, because once grades are in, it becomes a lot more complicated to make changes to the gradebook. Now, once you have gradebooks configured, students can simply go to course progress, although for students, it is actually called My Performance. And within that, there is something called class progress. Now, while you would think it's tempting for students to just go to grades, class progress is actually the place where they get access to all their feedback as well as their grades. Now, as the instructor, you'll get a view of every student, but a student would simply be dumped right into their personal view, which shows their grades. And then if they jump to discussions or assignments or anything like that, they will be able to look specifically at what they have done and what grades and what feedback they have gotten in there. And you can also use this to look at when students have accessed the course. And there's some other reports that might be useful to you. Last thing I really want to show you is under course tools, there's something called course admin. And there's a tool under here called manage dates. There it is. Now this gives you a list of everything in the course and any release and date due dates that it has on it, with the exception of due dates for discussions, which have to be manually handled. Now, this gets super overwhelming very quickly, so I always sort by specific tools, but it's a really easy way to look for any mistakes, especially if you've copied a course. And just make sure that everything's in the same year, everything looks good. And if I need to edit something, I can simply edit the dates right here. Now, once you've finished everything that you need to do for a course, you can copy a course into another semester or another section. Simply drop us a line and we will give you the instructions on how to do that. So with that, I know that was a speed run through the entire thing, but are there any questions? Or do you have
Does the
anything to add,
setup
Gary?
does the
Right.
setup wizard for Gradebook allow us to create equations that allow us to combine assignments together in a certain way for total columns?
Not per se. What I would say, usually you would use a weighted grade book and then do the math within the what's called the column manager. And then you can set the different weights of each item within a category so that that category is added together to um be included within the final grade of the course. What it does not allow you to do is actively do something like saying, okay, I want these two assignments added together and then curved upwards by 90%. At that point, if it's more than just basic weight balancing, it really needs to be done in a spreadsheet and then imported in. And again, that's something we'd be happy to help you with during office hours or via the help system.
I did want to add that if you do have any questions outside of the office hours, going to the CTS help desk or help@oswego.edu to request assistance is the best way to reach out to us.
Great.
What about red shelf inclusive access links on Brightspace to my math lab and other links like that?
So they
How
will
do you set
usually
those up?
they will usually be added to your course automatically. If there is an issue though, it's just under existing activities, external learning tools, and Red Shelf digital learning materials.
Is it that one or is it the 1.1 OSW link? Because I've been told to use that one instead.
So it
Oh, okay, it
depends on
depends on the yep, go ahead, Carrie.
it depends on what system you're using. If you are using the other one, it's probably because you were told to use that, and it's because this whatever program, whatever company you're working with is not set up for the 1.3.
Yeah,
So go with
that's
what you're told.
yeah, that's very specific publishers that are still using 1.1. However, the configuration to link Red Shelf is done through the bookstore, so make sure you keep an eye out for the links before the semester that tell you, hey, you need to contact the bookstore to set up your Red Shelf link. And if there's any problem, this again is under Dan Laird's purview. So you can just send a link to help@oswego.edu and they will connect you with him. So Ben, I'm not sure what you mean by integrate. You can copy content from one semester to another. And you can do that either as the entire course or as individual pieces of a course. So does that answer your question?
Yes, so as an entire course, I was just curious about so if we have a list of assignments and their due dates, I was just curious how how that's going to be updated as that copying process. If you're copying a course and the due dates are obviously going to be different and need to be changed.
So when you copy a course, the very last thing you get is the option to shift dates around. But honestly, I usually go in and use the date manager simply because from one semester to the next, you've got different vacations and things like that. And it rarely maps nicely if you just say, okay, move all the dates forward 365 days or 180 days or whatever the appropriate amount is. So yeah, that aggregator that shows you the due dates for everything, that's what I use.
Perfect, thank you. Can you just quickly show where the course copying feature is?
Yeah, sure. I'd recommend again that you make a request because we'll send you the documentation for it, but it's just course tools, course admin, and then you've got import export copy components. You'd start by searching for the offering, which gives you a pop-up that you can't see, but you can search for any course on there. And once you add the selected course, you'll see that course. And you always want to start in the empty course and you're copying the course with content. And then if you're just doing the whole kit and caboodle, you just hit the blue button. Otherwise, you have to dive into select components and pick exactly what you want to get pulled in.
All right, I'll give it a shot. Thanks.
Yep. Like I said, just drop us a line or actually even go to oswego.edu DLE and go to help and support. This has our Zoom office hours and our Zoom link, but it also has a lot of helpful documentation. And so you'll see down here, there is instructions for copying content or copying individual content. And those are knowledge base articles that were written specifically for the Oswego system.
Great. Thank you, Doug. Thank you,
All
everyone.
right, thank you everybody for attending. Hopefully it was useful, and please feel free to follow up with us, because again, I know this is kind of a sprint through the was it through the briar patch. So we're always happy to help.